I've been working on getting FreeDOS to boot on my 286. And as part of that, I have a lot of cleanup in my BIOS code and added functionality I need in my BIOS code. And a lot that I'm learning just about CF cards and the IDE interface and all of these different concepts. And while I'm not there yet, I am seeing some progress. And in this video, I'm just going to share some of the things that I'm seeing, the stuff that I'm doing, and maybe some of the challenges that I have in front of me that I haven't quite figured out yet. And I'm going to start by just turning on my system. So maybe real quick, I have my IDE interface card. I have a quick little IDE to CF card adapter. And I've also purchased one of these. It's basically a little PCI Express that has an IDE adapter, and in it I put in a CF card adapter with a CF card. And I have a separate computer that I can plug this into that is just running FreeDOS, nothing else on it. And from that, then I can properly configure these CF cards. I can partition them, format them, install FreeDOS, get the kernel, all that stuff on the CF cards and prepare it to be put into here. Later, I'll jump into a virtualized FreeDOS, but I was finding that I could not get these properly configured from a virtual environment. Even when I connected this as a raw disk and tried to do my partitioning and everything setup-wise from that, it was not working. It wasn't building basically, I think it was the partition table quite right. It wasn't geometry information, I think it was partition table, but anyways, something wasn't working, so I ended up going to this route here with this little adapter, and that has been working better. So what you're seeing here is my IDE interface with this card sticking this way instead of this one that sticks down, and that's just so that I can easily pull this and not have to pull the card out and not have to run a ribbon cable extension like I was doing previously. Later, I will have a new version of this PCB with these rotated pointing up appropriately. And I'll end up using this or one of these with a 90-degree connector on it. But if I turn on my system, what you're going to see is that I'm recording the VGA output, and I'm also recording my workstations, basically my benchtop workstations, the output for the serial debugging. And a couple of things, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to boot the system off the CF card. So it's got to get the bootloader, it's got to find the bootloader, load the bootloader, and then from that bootloader, find the kernel file, and then start executing whatever's in the kernel file. And throughout all of that, anytime there's an interrupt call to my BIOS, I'm trying to log it to the output along with any of the actual VGA output. I'm also logging to my serial output. And on a cold boot, which I just did, I always get stuck on some keyboard interrupt type of stuff, keyboard reading from FreeDOS. But if I do a cycle here, typically I don't run into it on a warm. And in that case, I noticed that my little nano was upset. So I'm just going to reset it and reset the system. We'll try this again. And so as the system comes up, I can see my post screen worked. That's fine. I can see on my serial output, it's logging tons of information. And I'm basically then letting the kernel do its thing. And that kernel is making interrupt calls to my BIOS code. Now in this case, you notice it didn't get stuck on this keyboard thing that it was looping on before, but it made it all the way through loading the kernel. The kernel's in memory, the kernel's running. It displayed the copyright notice, then it moved into initializing disk, and then it screamed that there's something with the disk that it doesn't quite trust. And I think what it should be using is this 76.127.63 for cylinders, heads, sectors, but for some reason it's calculating 48.15.63, and I need to track down where that's coming from, why that's doing that. But I have gone in and tried to manually override that in the code, actually in the FreeDOS kernel, to use the 76.127.63 and not swap it out, and it didn't get any further, so there's still other problems here. But then it continues and it says, okay, I've got a C drive. I'm going to start at the cylinder head sector of 011. It's a 303 meg partition or drive, and I'm going to try to go get the partition table, and then it fails. And that's currently where I'm stopped, is at that point. I've not made it past that yet. And I'll have to get in and figure out, well, what can I do to get past that? Now on my serial output, if I take a look at this for a second, I want to just scroll up so you can kind of see maybe what all I'm doing here. So when I first turn on the system, one of the first things I do is I read out the device information from the CF card directly. So I make an IDE series of calls and ask for its information. This is an ASCII representation, but I also store then some of that information in variables. And for example, when I query the device, it says this is what by default I have for cylinders, heads, and sectors. And then it also reports out what it's currently using, and those numbers match. But as I got into this, it seems like cylinders can't go above 0 to 1023 or whatever it is. There's a 10-bit limit basically there to represent cylinders. And this number here is well above 10 bits. So you then have to do some math. And so I now do that in my BIOS. So I read those values, and then I correct them. And in this case, I translate this into this down here. And that tells me what I'm calling adjusted cylinders, heads, and sectors should be, and what I'm going to tell the operating system it should be using as I get into that. And one thing I did is I did take this card, I put it in here into this other little PCI Express adapter, put it in a different system, and I ran a utility on it. And that utility is this here, this Ranish partition manager. And then it comes back and it reads, and this is a completely different system, nothing to do with my build or anything that I'm doing. This is just what's built into that utility and whatever maybe this little card is using for BIOS. But it came back and said, well, your device should be a 973, 12863. And I just use that to kind of compare what am I calculating as I get over here. And maybe I can just pull up a calculator. And so if I come down and I say, well, for cylinders, I'm doing 3CD, well, that's 973. So that matches. Heads, an 80 hex is 128 decimal. So that matches. And a 3F in hex is a 63 in decimal. So my adjusted values are matching what this other utility and BIOS are reporting for that device. So that gives me some confidence that maybe the calculations I'm doing there are on the right track at least. But then I run into problems, of course, when I'm trying to actually get this FAT table loaded in as FreeDOS boots. And I don't know if that's because I have more than one primary partition the way this shows up, if it's something else in my sector 0 issues. I'm going to have to track that down. I don't know what the next step is there other than to do a bunch of debugging and analyze what's on that and what the FreeDOS is going through and trying to access and expect. Now, if I flip back to my serial output for a second, then after I go through and I do that adjustment, I store those values, and then any BIOS interrupt calls asking for that type of data, I'm going to feed it these adjusted numbers. I read out sector 0, and I can see I have the signature on here. I think this section of data here is probably my partition table that just simply shares data about the partition setup. And then, of course, I've got all my bootloader stuff. And then you can see it just logs lots of stuff here. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm logging what interrupt and what function. So this tells me that interrupt 13 function 41 is being called by FreeDOS. And I can go back to my code. And in my code, let me just open up Visual Studio here. I've got a disk, and I know that interrupt 13 is disk services, but now what's function 41? So I can come in here and say interrupt 13, here's my handler for that. And I can scroll down and I have a function 41, which is it's checking if I support certain extensions as far as working with this disk. And basically I'm going to return a negative, I don't support those. So this is what it sent into the interrupt. This is my A, B, C, D register. and then my CSDSES, and then a hex representation of the flags register. And so I've got all of that, what's coming in, what's coming out. And like here, I can look at my notes and see that if CF is set, in other words, if CF is a 1, that tells FreeDOS that I don't support these extensions that it's asking about. And so I set that carry flag here, and that would be bit 0, and I can see it came up to an odd number. So that tells me that bit flag came through. Okay, great. FreeDOS is then asking to do a function 2. I can scroll up in my code and see that I've got a function 2, which is to go out and do a read. And I have a separate procedure then that does that read. So IDE read, and it goes out and fetches the data and puts it into wherever FreeDOS is asking me to place it. And again, that's all handled through basically what's coming in and what's coming out as far as registers are concerned. And again, I can use this information over here to kind of debug and say, well, what came in, what went out. You know, like in this case, CF should be a 0 if it's successful. So I'm expecting an even number here. That tells me that carry flag was appropriately a 0. But then I can see that FreeDOS continues, and we've got a lot of 13.2. So it's doing a whole bunch of sector reads. And if I go through that, then eventually I'll get to something where it's read through enough sectors, it's identified where the kernel file is, it starts to load the kernel file. And so I can get down here and I can see that, you know, maybe there's other interrupts. Interrupt 12 gets called, and if I don't know what that is, then I can jump back. I have a general interrupt file over here, and I can see 12 is memory size. It's looking for how much memory my computer has, and I tell it has 640. And I can do that as I debug and work my way through this, basically. Other things that I could maybe catch as I look at this, you know, whatever you saw coming out to the VGA screen, I'm also echoing into my serial output, so I can see that. Here I can see an interrupt 12. Again, so something about memory size. There's an 11 that it's calling, which is asking for which equipment do I have in my system, and I'm returning a set of data that tries to identify what I have for hardware. And then it asks, again, it comes back to an interrupt 11, then interrupt 16, that has to do with keyword services. And then I get back into the disk services. It's doing a bunch of calls, and here I can see it's actually doing a disk init, is what FreeDOS, you know, is outputting to saying I'm starting this disk initialization. In it, it's using disk services interrupt 13, and then asking for functions 8 and 15. And then I can come back here and look at that and say, well, what is an 8? And I come down here, and 8 is to get drive params. And a 15 is to read this DASD, which I don't know a lot about, but basically information about the disk. And so in here, then I try to return out the appropriate details that, based on my understanding of these interrupts, what they should be taking in and what they should be sending out if things are working or not working. And so I do those manipulations and send back the appropriate information. And again, I can validate that through the debug output here. But at some point, then I got to this warning, and then it says this is what I'm going to leverage to get going. And then I ran into problems where it says, okay, I can't read. And I got an error reading partition table. And that one I must not have been logging the output, because I don't see it here in my serial output. And that eventually then it did a 13, which is a interrupt for disk services. 00 is a reset. And that's where I'm stuck. But that's kind of what I'm working through. I would say, as I've been going through this, maybe some things to point out. I did have to change up. I had completely done it incorrectly in my main file here. I had a whole bunch of variables, what I thought were variables, set up in this data file, and I included that. And I was initializing those just with a 0. When it ends up that actually doesn't place them down in this lower section of memory where I thought they were, it was actually placing them after my code further up in memory. So I fixed that. I moved all of what I was thinking of as variables over to this BSS file. And so then I have all of these labels set up, and I'm setting aside memory. And instead of 0, I'm using the question mark. And then I put that into this BSS section. And now when I build and run, those variables are actually down in this space down here, sub linear address of 600. So segment 60 and offset 0000 is where my kernel needs to get loaded. And so when I boot up the bootloader, it gets the kernel loaded down here. But that also means that all of my stuff needs to fit underneath this 60 segment address. And so I did have to clean up some of my memory a little bit on how I was using that space and shrink it down a little bit. But all that is done. So I can fit my entire interrupt vector table, the full 1K there, everything I need for my BIOS then for variables fits within this space, and then the kernel is going to sit here. So this is just kind of helping me understand the map a little bit as it boots up, and then above that I am showing the full memory addressing space that I'm using. But this down here is more for how this kernel gets loaded for FreeDOS. So I've been doing a bunch of BIOS cleanup. That's all been good. Been learning a bunch through that. Again, I think getting the CF card set up correctly has been a little bit of a challenge, but this card again has been helping in this other system. Plus, it's another system I can test. I can actually boot directly off of this. It works great. I can really test out, make sure, from a FreeDOS and just hardware, this CF card perspective, everything's working before I bring it over here and find out that something doesn't work. I can at least compare behavior. Maybe another note, I do have FreeDOS here, and let me just boot up this FreeDOS here, kind of show you as I get in now and I need to debug why is it having a problem with whether it's my CHS values for my CF card or there's something else that I need to figure out. I'm going to use this virtual box. I've got a VM running, and in that VM then what I can do is boot it. I have network access and I map a drive. So I'm going to go ahead and basically log in. So I'm in DOS, FreeDOS. I have now a mapped drive, which is this S drive. And that S drive is actually going across my physical network to a Linux machine that's running Samba so that I can share files. And then from there, I have access to that share, and from my host PC, then I can also come into that location. So I can get to that exact same folder from my DOS VM and from the host that's hosting that VM. And it's just using a network-based share to do that. Now, the reason that's important, though, is I can then go over to my D drive in this VM. And what you're going to see in here is I have the source code for the kernel set up. And in here now, I can edit that source code and I can build it. So I might, as an example, go into the kernel folder and I might look at, I think there's an init disk C code that I might want to work with. So I can then edit that init disk.c, modify that, put in some extra debugging, safety checks, whatever it is that I'm trying to figure out why my specific setup isn't working. But then I can come back here and I can then do a build. And my build is working fine. And actually what I can do is clean and just kind of clean everything out. Maybe I will go back into my kernel and I will edit that. And I think I had put in, let me do a search. Here I had put in, for example, some extra, when it hits this piece of code, it's going to write out to my screen here too, just so that I know I got to that point or whatever I want to do for debugging. But I'm going to modify the file so that there are changes. And now I'm going to go back and actually do a build. And so it goes through everything here, the full build of FreeDOS at this point, and I can see it then copied over those into my bin folder. So now if I look at the files, I can see that I have these outputs here that were just generated. So I've created you can see I have this currently, the default is I'm targeting a 186 architecture, and I can modify that. There's a configuration file that I can just say what's my default that I want to build for. But if I take that KWC 186.16.sys, basically it's saying I'm building it for the 186 processor, 16-bit FAT. I can now copy that to my S drive. And you can see over here to the right, that has popped up and is showing up there just fine. So not the fastest copy as it goes out. I think the speed's more on this DOS virtualization side of things. And then my Linux is also virtualized on a different platform, but it got the file into there. And so now what I can do, I can pop this card out. I have a reader on this host, and I can just copy over that kernel onto that card, put it back into this computer, and fire it up. So that's how I can build kernels, play with this, and get it onto this card fairly easily, given the setup that I'm working within here. So I've got work to do. I have to figure out why I can't get that FAT table or partition table, whatever the error message is, using suspect partition, error reading partition table. So I'm not able to get that partition table loaded properly here. I've got to figure that out. And I probably have a whole lot of assembly coding cleanup to do yet. There's probably interrupts I'm not supporting yet, and that I'll have to keep on working at. But my goal is to try to get FreeDOS to boot, at least get me to that initial, prompt where it's prompting for the date, or get me to just a command prompt if I can get the command interpreter loaded after the kernel. I need to get past this, getting that FAT table, or in this case, a partition table loaded properly. And there's other little glitches I'm finding along the way, and just one by one I have to track those down, whether it's in my code or it's something on the hardware, or the different behavior I see depending on which CF card I use. I see a different behavior, and I think it comes down to, am I using FAT16 or FAT32? Is the master boot record set up properly? Is it creating the partition table correctly? Disk geometry, I'm sure, is part of all of this. All stuff I've got to keep working on. But that's what I have for now, and maybe it's not, I'm not at my destination yet, but I'm making progress, and I think I'm learning a tremendous amount about this IDE and CF cards and FreeDOS as I go through all of this, and learning quite a bit about x86 development too. Anyways, good enough for now. Thanks for watching. As always, if you're seeing something here I'm missing, or can give me any tips or tricks or advice to move this along, please drop me a note, and I always appreciate the feedback.